Hello, everybody, and welcome to the NABCA webinar, the 4 Prohibited Trade Practices Violations for Beverage Alcohol. Before I introduce our speaker, Lisa Gesser, I wanted to address a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is one of several webinars the NABCA is conducting to educate and inform those in the business of beverage alcohol. Others are in the works and will be announced soon. Today's webinar will be about 1 hour. Now, due to the nature of trade practice violations and the nuances involved in deciding on an outcome, attendees for this webinar are encouraged to send their questions directly to the TTB to their website at Trade Practices, TRADEPRACTICES, all one word, at ttb.gov. There will not be an opportunity to ask questions during today's presentation. And this presentation is being recorded and will be available through the nabca.org website within 7 to 10 business days. You'll be able to find it under the Resources tab on the NABCA website. I'd now like to introduce Lisa Gesser. Lisa serves as the Program Manager for the Advertising and Trade Practices in the Market Compliance Office for the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB. In this capacity, she is responsible for overseeing the trade practice program in addition to receiving and responding to industry member questions and assessing complaints concerning unlawful trade practices. Immediately preceding her appointment as program manager for the Market Compliance Office, Ms. Gesser served as the program manager for the Federal Alcohol Administration Act for the Regulations and Rulings Division. Lisa, I now turn this webinar over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Okay, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm a little discombobulated today because I'm working on a makeshift computer. My computer died this morning. So anyway, let's get started. As you all know, TTB is responsible for the regulation and taxation of alcohol beverages in the United States. One aspect of this regulation is the enforcement of what are known as the trade practice laws and regulations, which are designed to promote a level playing field among industry members, as well as help ensure retailer independence. During this presentation, we'll explore the 4 prohibited trade practices, including tied house, exclusive outlets, commercial bribery, and consignment sales. We'll have a lot of material to cover in a short period of time, and as Margaret stated, I will not be taking questions during this presentation, but if you have questions, please jot them down, and you can forward them to that tradepractice.gov. So now let's get the legal stuff out of the way. This is our required disclaimer that we use on all of our presentations. This presentation is being provided to help you understand the federal trade practice laws and regulations. It's not intended to establish any new or change any existing definitions, interpretations, standards, or procedures regarding those laws and regulations. And eventually this presentation may be made obsolete by changes in laws and regulations. For the most current requirement, please contact TTB on our website, ttb.gov. Our regulations are available there. My apologies for my cell phone going off. Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to be discussing what are the TTB trade practice regulations, what activities are covered, when does a violation occur. We'll also touch on some TTB guidance that has been issued, and we'll briefly discuss some of the recent enforcement actions TTB has taken with respect to trade practice violations. We'll also touch on some of the educational efforts that TTB has undertaken as well. Before we get into a discussion about the specific trade practices that are prohibited under the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, or FAA Act as we typically call it, I want to talk a little bit about the Act's history. The FAA Act was signed into law by President Roosevelt in 1935. The purpose of the act was to keep the criminal element out of the alcohol industry and maintain compliance using a permitting system, regulate the formulation, labeling, and advertising of alcoholic beverages, regulate the promotional and marketing trade practices that might lead to corruption or excessive consumption, which is what this presentation focuses on, and to protect the consumer. To accomplish the FAA Act's goals, the law does the following things. It implements a basic permit requirement. It defines and outlaws certain trade practices, which is just another term for marketing or business practices. And it regulates the labeling and advertising of alcoholic beverages. Consistent with the goal of getting and keeping criminals and bad actors out of the alcohol beverage industry, the FAA Act imposes a basic permit requirement. Under the permit system, with one exception, all producers, importers, and wholesalers of alcoholic beverages must register and receive a basic permit before starting operations. For example, importers and wholesalers of distilled spirits, wine, and malt beverages must register and obtain a TTB basic permit before conducting business. Additionally, all producers of distilled spirits and wine must register and obtain a basic permit before conducting business. However, malt beverage producers are not required to obtain a basic permit. Instead, brewers must file a brewer's notice before conducting business. Permits are conditioned on compliance with the FAA Act's trade practice provisions. Permits can be revoked, they can be suspended, annulled for violations of the FAA Act trade practice provisions. While brewers are not required to obtain a permit, they cannot violate the trade practice laws without penalty. Consistent with the goal to regulate promotional and marketing trade practices that might lead to corruption or excessive consumption, the FAA Act imposes restrictions on certain unlawful trade practices. The purpose of the trade practice regulations is to prevent wholesaler, importer, and producer control over the retailer, and to help keep a level playing field among industry members. Of particular importance with respect to practices involving malt beverages is the penultimate clause. The term penultimate clause literally means the second to the last paragraph when we're referring to Title 27 of the United States Code, Section 205. The penultimate clause provides that in the case of malt beverages, trade practice provisions apply to transactions between a retailer or trade buyer in any state and a brewer, importer, or wholesaler of malt beverages outside of such state, only to the extent that the law of that state imposes similar requirements with respect to similar transactions. The legislative history of the penultimate clause of Section 205 demonstrates that Congress had a concern that the federal government should not act in areas unless the state has deemed the area as one requiring action for malt beverages only. So what does that mean exactly? Basically, for trade practices that involve malt beverages or beer products, TT must show that there is a similar state law for the federal trade practices rules to apply. When I say similar, I mean similar, not exactly the same. There's a very, very broad interpretation of what constitutes similarity. A similar state law doesn't even have to be strictly an alcohol-related statute. Such laws can be found in the state's general business rules. And remember, a similar state law is only required for practices involving malt beverages, and it's not needed for a violation involving distilled spirits or wine. There are 4 trade practices that are prohibited for industry members, such as producers, wholesalers, and importers. Those are tied house, exclusive outlet, commercial bribery, and consignment sales. We'll discuss each of these practices in detail. Before we begin on the following slides, you're going to see references, and I've already talked about 27 USC, which stands for Title 27 of the United States Code. This is where the FAA Act, including the federal trade practice laws, are codified. And you'll also see references to 27 CFR, which stands for Title 27 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is where the Federal Trade Practice Regulations issued by TTB are codified. Throughout the presentation, you'll see citations. I've been talk about citations to different sections of the regulations or the law, and that's where you can go to find additional information, the full text of the specific law I'm talking about. So, under the Tied House rules and regulations, it's unlawful for an industry member to induce a retailer, directly or indirectly, to purchase alcohol beverages from the industry member to the exclusion of alcohol beverages offered for sale in interstate commerce by other persons. Generally, when we refer to an industry member, we mean anyone who produces, distributes, or imports alcohol beverage products. A retailer is anyone who sells alcohol beverage products to consumers. The Tied House regulations apply to activities between an industry member, such as a producer, importer, or wholesaler, and a retailer. They do not apply to activities between industry members. So they wouldn't apply to activities between producers and wholesalers, for example. Under the Tied House rules, there are 7 means to induce. And when we say means to induce, that's another way of just saying ways to induce. There are specific practices that could lead to a Tied House violations. The first is B1, which is acquiring or holding an interest in a retailer's license, such as an industry member owning a percentage of the retail business. The second is acquiring or holding an interest in the real property or personal property of a retailer's business, such as an industry member acquiring a mortgage on, say, a retailer's land or building. There is exception to these 2 provisions, and that is an industry member who owns a retailer outright, that is 100% ownership, does not hold an interest that would violate these provisions. Anything less than 100% ownership is considered a means to induce. So this is why you see a lot of breweries that have brew pubs. They own their own retail business. As long as it's 100% ownership, the trade practice regulations do not apply. The third means to induce is very, very broad, and it covers giving, renting, lending, or selling to a retailer any equipment, fixtures, signs, supplies, money, services, or other things of value. TTB regulations list a number of exceptions that apply to this specific provision, allowing certain things of value to be given to a retailer. And we're going to cover some of those exceptions later. We call them the subpart D sections because they happen to be in the Part 6 subpart D section of the regulations. However, it should be noted that these exceptions only apply to this particular provision of the regulations, to B3. So they wouldn't apply to, say, violating B4. The fourth means is paying or crediting a retailer for advertising, display, or distribution services. An example of this would be paying slotting fees, where an industry member pays a retailer for shelf space or to get their product on tap. The fifth means to induce is by guaranteeing a loan or repaying a retailer's financial obligations. Number 6 is extending credit to a retailer beyond 30 days from the date of delivery. And finally, number 7 is requiring a retailer to take and dispose of a certain quota of alcoholic beverages. An example of this would be requiring a retailer purchase one product in order to be able to purchase an allocated product. We refer to that as a tie-in sale. Another example is, say, requiring a retailer to buy a certain amount of product each week or month, or quota. Here's some real-life examples of inducements under the Tied House rules. An industry member provides free labor to reset stock on a retailer's premises, including another industry member's products. is one of the subpart D exceptions we talked about earlier. An industry member is allowed to move their own stock on the retailer's premises, but they are not allowed to move the stock of another industry member. Another example would be if an industry member purchases or rents display space or shelf space from the retailer, or in other words, pays a slotting allowance. Another example would be if an industry member pays for live entertainment at an on-premise retailer in exchange for product promotion or preferential display space within the retailer's premises. This would also apply if the industry member were making payments through a third-party marketing or promoting firm. And a final example would be if an industry member tells a retailer they have to buy a slow-moving alcohol beverage product in order to obtain a product that's in high demand. And this is what we refer to as a tie-in sale. So let's talk about those exceptions. The regulations in 27 CFR Part 6 list some exceptions that allow certain items or services or other things of value to be provided or sold to retailers, subject to very specific limitations and conditions without being considered a means to induce under 205(b)(3). The list of exceptions are found in 27 CFR Part 6, Subpart D, hence the name, the Subpart D exceptions. These exceptions include product displays, point-of-sale advertising materials, consumer tastings and samplings at retailers' locations, limited equipment and supplies, stocking and rotation and pricing services. Now, there are very, very specific limitations to each one of these exceptions. Generally, the items as they are listed in Subpart D exceptions, they're items or services that are of very, very little value. If you ever have a question whether something constitutes a product display or point-of-sale advertising materials, you can always send in a question to TTB at that tradepractices@ttb.gov, and we'll answer whether or not it falls into one of these exceptions. There are two things to remember when we're looking at the exceptions. First, and this is very, very important, if it is not explicitly stated in the regulations as an exception, it's probably not covered by the exception. Don't assume something similar or related is also an exception. And second, these exceptions do not apply to other provisions of the FAA Act. They only apply to that 205(b)(3) rule against providing, giving, lending, or selling things of value to a retailer. For example, you cannot supply something that's listed as a Subpart D exception to violate another provision of the FAA Act. An example of that would be you cannot provide, say, allowable equipment and services in exchange for preferential product placement or shelf space. In addition to the limitations and conditions, there are some record-keeping requirements. For an exception to apply, industry members must keep and maintain records on their premises for some of the items they furnish to retailers. And that includes product displays, equipment and supplies, samples, coupons, participation in retailer association activities, and merchandise. So when does a violation occur? Under the federal regulations, there are certain elements that we must establish to prove a tied house violation. First, we have to show that there was an inducement provided from the industry member. Remember, an industry member is a producer, importer, or wholesaler to the retailer. This does not apply to transactions between industry members. And it also doesn't apply in situations where an industry member wholly owns the retailer. Second, we have to show that the activities occurred in or had the effect upon interstate or foreign commerce. It's always best to assume this element will be easily satisfied, as most alcohol beverages are sold or offered for sale in interstate commerce. Third, we have to show that the practice of providing the inducement resulted in exclusion of another industry member's products. There are two parts to exclusion. Exclusion results when a retailer purchases less of a competitor's product than they otherwise would have, and the practice places or has the potential to place the retailer's independence at risk. Keep in mind that the Tight House regulations also do describe certain prohibited activities that TTB has determined places the retailer's independence at risk. And if you engage in one of those activities, we only need to show that the retailer purchased less than it otherwise would have of a competitor's product. Those activities which place a retailer independence at risk are found in 27 CFR 6.152, and they include resetting stock on the retailer's premises other than your own stock, paying slotting fees, that is, purchasing or renting display, shelf, or storage warehouse space, ownership of less than 100% interest in the retailer, where that ownership is used to influence the retailer's purchases, or requiring a retailer to purchase one product in order to purchase another product, and that's the tie-in sale that we talked about earlier. In addition to listing those practices that we just talked about that have been determined to place a retailer's independence at risk, the regulations also provide criteria that are indicators that a particular practice may place retailer independence at risk. And those criteria are codified in our regulations at 27 CFR 6.153. Lastly, the fourth element, which says similar state law, this element only applies to practices involving malt beverages. And that is, we need to show that there is a similar state law to the federal rules. The state law only has to be similar, not exact, and it doesn't even have to be a law that specifically pertains to alcohol. This element, this number fourth element, does not apply to wine and distilled spirits. So if TTB cannot establish all of these elements, they cannot prove a violation of federal law. The inducement standing alone is not a federal violation. The second prohibited trade practice we're going to discuss is exclusive outlet. Under exclusive outlet, it's unlawful for an industry member to require a retailer, by agreement or otherwise, to purchase alcohol beverages from that industry member to the exclusion of alcohol beverages sold or offered for sale by others in interstate or foreign commerce. One of the main differences between exclusive outlet and Tight House is that Tight House deals with inducements to purchase, while exclusive outlet deals with requirements to purchase. And exclusive outlet may or may not include inducements. The exclusive outlet regulations can be found in 27 CFR Part 8, while the law can be found in 27 U.S.C. 205A. And just a reminder that the laws and regulations are accessible from our website at www.ttb.gov. Like the Tight House provisions, the exclusive outlet provisions apply to activities between industry members and retailers. They do not apply to activities between industry members. So, for example, it would not apply to activities between, say, a producer and a wholesaler, but it would apply to activities between a producer and a retailer, or a wholesaler and a retailer. The requirement to purchase includes those made by voluntary purchase agreements or contracts between the industry member and retailers, and also requirements made through force or coercion. Contracts, either written or oral, that have an effect of requiring the retailer to purchase alcohol beverage products from the industry member beyond a single sales transaction are prohibited. The regulations, however, do allow a supply contract for 1 year or less between industry members and a retailer if the industry member sells on an as-needed basis and the retailer is not required to purchase any minimum quantity. An example of exclusive outlet would be ABC Wholesaler enters into a sales contract with the pub, a liquor retailer, in which the pub agrees to purchase all of its alcoholic beverages exclusively from ABC, to the exclusion of alcoholic beverages offered for sale by others in interstate commerce. In exchange, ABC will sell its products to the pub for a very favorable cost. Also covered under the exclusive outlet provisions are third-party arrangements where an industry member enters into an agreement with a non-retailer, such as an arena, which results in the retailer being required to purchase the industry member's products. For example, an industry member enters into contracts with the owners of an arena. The owners lease the concession rights at the arena to a retailer, and they're able to control the purchasing decisions of that retailer. The owner, as a result of the contract requirement with the industry member, requires the retailer to purchase that industry member's products to the exclusion of other industry member products. So for exclusive outlet, when does a violation occur? The same as tied house, there are certain elements that we have to prove before we can cite an exclusive outlet violation. First, we have to show that there was a requirement to purchase. This can be by agreement, either written or unwritten, or through compulsion or coercion. Remember, the exclusive outlet provisions do not apply to transactions between industry members, only between industry members and retailers. Second, we have to show that the activities occurred or had an effect upon interstate or foreign commerce. Again, it's best to assume that this element will be easily established, since most alcoholic beverages are sold or offered for sale interstate or foreign commerce. Third, we have to show that the requirement resulted in exclusion of another industry member's products. And again, same here, there's two parts to exclusion. Exclusion occurs when the required purchase resulted in a retailer purchasing less of a competitor's product, and the practice places or has the potential to place the retailer's independence at risk. Same as tied house, the regulations do provide specific activities that have been determined to place a retailer's independence at risk. And those are found in 27 CFR 8.52, and they include purchases by a retailer as a result, whether directly or indirectly, of an industry member's threat or act of physical or economic harm. And two, contracts that require a retailer to purchase from the industry member and expressly restrict the retailer from purchasing from other industry members. In addition to those specific activities that are outlined that place a retailer's independence at risk in the regulations, the regulations list practices, criteria that are indicators that a particular practice may place the retailer's independence at risk. Those criteria are also in the regulations, and you can find those at 27 CFR section 8.55. And lastly, the fourth element applies, again, only to malt beverages, and that is we need to show that there is a similar state law to the federal rules. And again, the state law only has to be similar, not exact, and it doesn't have to be an alcohol statute. The requirement for exclusive outlet, the number one on our screen, that by itself is not a federal violation. We have to establish all of the elements. If all of these elements are not established, there is no violation of federal law. The next prohibited trade practice we're going to discuss is commercial bribery. Under the commercial bribery provisions, it's unlawful for an industry member to induce a trade buyer to buy its products to the exclusion of products sold by others by commercial bribery, or by giving money or gifts to an employee, officer, or representative of the trade buyer. Trade buyer is a new term that we haven't talked about yet. A trade buyer can be a retailer or a wholesaler. The commercial bribery regulations are found in 27 CFR Part 10, and the law is found in 27 USC 205C. So you know a little difference here on the commercial bribery applicability slide. Unlike tied house and exclusive outlet, commercial bribery provisions apply to activities between industry members. And they also apply, again, to activities between industry members and retailers. For example, the commercial bribery provisions would apply to activities between a producer and a wholesaler, as well as activities between a wholesaler and a retailer. Commercial bribery includes the practice of providing secret payments of money or giving gifts to employees and agents, such as trips, ball game tickets, and other gifts, to induce them to promote purchases of that industry member's products without the employer's knowledge. Commercial bribery also includes giving money, gifts, or prizes to officers, employees, or representatives of a wholesaler or retailer to induce them to purchase more product from that industry member. So they apply to secret payments and not secret payments, as long as the payments are going to the officers, employees, or representatives of a wholesaler. Commercial bribery does not apply to gifts or payments given to the wholesale entity itself. While an industry member may give the money or things of value to a wholesale entity, the wholesaler cannot act as a pass-through to its employees. The wholesaler would be considered a pass-through if there was an agreement or understanding that the money or thing of value would be passed through to their employees, or it's obvious by the nature of the item, such as a trip, that it will be passed through, or the wholesaler's records do not reflect the money or item as an asset of the wholesale entity. An example of commercial bribery would be if a producer offers a purchasing agent for a chain of restaurants a $200 weekly cash incentive in return for buying the producer's alcohol beverage products. The purchasing agent agrees and secretly receives the payments and also stops buying or buys less of a competitor's product. All of this is done without the employer's knowledge. Another example would be of an inducement under commercial bribery would be a sales contest, where an industry member offers gifts or bonuses to a trade buyer's employees to promote sales of the industry member's products. The contest indirectly induces the trade buyer to purchase more of those products. So when does a violation occur for commercial bribery? First, we have to show that the industry member provided an inducement in the form of money or gifts or other things of value, given directly or indirectly to officers, employees, or representatives of the trade buyer. And remember, a trade buyer can be a wholesaler or a retailer under commercial bribery. Second, we have to show that the activities occurred in or had an effect upon interstate or foreign commerce. Again, it's always best to assume that this element will be easily established as most alcohol beverages are sold in interstate commerce. And third, we have to show that the inducement resulted in exclusion of another industry member's products. Same as before, there are two parts to exclusion. Exclusion occurs when the inducement results in a trade buyer purchasing less of a competitor's product and the practice places or has the potential to place the trade buyer's independence at risk. The regulations provide one practice that absolutely places a retailer's independence at risk, and that is money given to an employee of a trade buyer without the knowledge or consent of the employer. That's secret payments in return for the employee agreeing to order from that industry member. So what that means is that if it's secret payments are involved, then all TTB has to do is show that the trade buyer purchase less than it would have of a competitor's product. In addition to listing that particular practice that has been deemed to place retailers and independents at risk, the regulations also provide criteria that are indicators that a particular practice may place the retailers and independents at risk. And those criteria are codified in our regulations at 27 CFR 10.54. And lastly, same as before, if it involves malt beverages, the activities involve malt beverages, TTB has to show that there's a similar state law. The inducement, again, same as here, is not, by itself is not a federal violation. We have to establish all of these elements, and if all of these elements cannot be established, there is no violation of federal law. The fourth and final prohibited trade practice we're going to discuss is consignment sales. Under the consignment sales rules, it's unlawful for an industry member to sell, offer to sell, or contract to sell to a trade buyer, or for the trade buyer to purchase, or offer to purchase, or contract to purchase alcoholic beverages on consignment, such as an arrangement where a trade buyer is under no obligation to pay for the products until they're sold, or under conditional sale, or with the privilege of return, such as an agreement made that whatever the trade buyer can't sell, it can be returned to the seller, or on any basis other than a bona fide sale, or if any part of the sale is conditioned on the acquisition of other products. The consignment sales regulations are found in 27 CFR Part 11, while the law can be found in 27 U.S.C. 205D. The applicability of the consignment sales rules is different from the other trade practice rules we've discussed so far. Consignment sales is the only prohibited trade practices that applies to both sides of the transaction. Additionally, they apply both to industry members and trade buyers. And remember, a trade buyer can be a retailer or a wholesaler. So these regulations apply to arrangements between industry members, such as producers and wholesalers, as well as between industry member and a retailer. It's very important to remember that when a consignment sale violation arises, both parties to the transaction are in violation. That's because it's prohibited to both sell and to purchase alcoholic beverages on consignment. There are some exceptions that will allow for the exchange or return of product for ordinary and usual commercial reasons. And those are specifically listed in the regulations, and they include delivery error, defective product, such as a product that's under a voluntary recall or leaking containers or damaged labels, product that is unlawful to sell, and this could be due to a change in regulation or a particular size of a container that's no longer authorized, or a certain brand is no longer permitted to be sold in the state, something of that nature. Termination of retail business, such as a retailer or wholesaler is going out of business or terminating a franchise. However, this does not apply to circumstances in which a retailer is retailing alcoholic beverages at, say, a special event, and then continues to retail at another location after the conclusion of the event. In other words, it only applies when a retailer or wholesaler stops and ceases all business operations. Next is a change in product, such as reformulation of the alcohol beverage or change in ingredients. Product that has been discontinued. And seasonal dealers. This seasonal dealer exception applies if you're a seasonal dealer and your establishment is only open, say, a portion of the year, such as only open in the summer or during the winter months, and the product is likely to spoil in the off season when your establishment is closed. And that's the big change here. It has to be where the product is likely to spoil in the off-season when your establishment is closed. While beer may spoil in off-season, it's highly unlikely that distilled spirits will. So this exception probably will not apply in the case of distilled spirits. The regulations also list two reasons that are not considered ordinary and usual reasons for return, and they are overstocked or slow-moving products and seasonal products. That is products for which there's only a limited seasonal demand, such as certain flavors, styles, packaging, specific to a certain time of the year. TTB also has issued rulings which describe the circumstances under which malt beverages can be returned for freshness concerns, and we're going to talk about those later when we're going over our guidance materials. Here are some examples of consignment sales. A wholesaler sells 300 cases of beer to a retailer with the understanding that it can be returned if it doesn't sell. Or an importer sells to a wholesaler under the condition the wholesaler doesn't have to pay until the product is sold to retailers. Let's look at the elements of a consignment sales violation. First, we have to show that there was a consignment sales arrangement. An industry member sold, offered to sell, or contracted to sell to a trade buyer, or a trade buyer purchased, offered to purchase, or contracted to purchase alcohol beverages from the seller on consignment, under conditional sale, with the privilege of return, on any basis other than a bona fide sale, or if any part of the sale is conditioned on the acquisition of other products. Second, we have to show the activities occurred in or had an effect upon interstate or foreign commerce. Again, it's always best to assume this element will be easily established. Third element only applies to transactions involving malt beverages, and in those cases, we must show that there is a similar state law. Just a reminder, the state law only has to be similar, not exact, and it doesn't have to be an alcohol statute. And this element does not apply to activities involving wine and distilled spirits. You'll notice for consignment sales, there's no exclusion requirement if the sale, purchase, or offer or contract is made in the course of interstate or foreign commerce. This is the only prohibited trade practice that does not require exclusion. Lastly, remember, if there is a consignment sales violation, both parties to that transaction are in violation. So in summary, we discussed the four prohibited trade practices, which are tied house, exclusive outlet, commercial bribery, and consignment sales. And we discussed the elements of a violation for each of these practices. And all elements of a violation must be present for there to be a violation. The exclusion element is required for all trade practices except for consignment sales. And for transactions involving malt beverages, remember, we also have to show that there is a similar state law. And that provision does not apply for wine and distilled spirits. When determining whether there is a requisite similar state law, TTB is guided by the degree of similarity and not whether the federal requirements have been actually adopted by the state. If there's no specific state alcoholic beverage law addressing a particular trade practice, TTB will look to the state general business and antitrust laws. TTB applies a broad interpretation of similarity. However, if an activity is specifically permitted by a state, the TTB trade practice regulations would not apply for malt beverages only. Remember, TTB does not have to show a similar state law for practices involving distilled spirits and wine. So even if the practice is specifically permitted by the state, if it is not permitted under the FAA Act, a violation would occur if it involves wine and distilled spirits. When questions or need for clarification of the TTB regulations arise, TTB and its predecessor agencies have issued guidance. These take form of rulings, industry circulars, and sometimes general guidance documents. The next few slides will touch on some of the more recent guidance provided to the industry with respect to the TTP trade practice regulations. I'm only going to touch on these quite briefly, but they may be viewed on our website at ttp.gov. And of course, if you have any questions, certainly send your questions to the trade practices at ttp.gov email page. Okay. So the first one is TTP Industry Circular 2012-1. This particular industry circular provides guidance regarding industry members' participation in retail promotional activities. In this circular, TTP provides guidance on its views of several permissible and impermissible activities for industry members who provide promotional support to alcohol beverage retailers. It discusses third-party marketing companies. It clarifies that those Subpart D exceptions we talked about are only applicable to the prohibition of providing things of value under 205(b)(3), and they do not apply to other provisions of the FAA Act. And it provides that Subpart D exceptions cannot be used to violate another provision of the FAA Act. TTP Industry Circular 2012-2. This is our tie-in sales industry circular. It reminds the industry members that tie-in sales of alcoholic beverages are prohibited under the tied house provisions of the FAA Act. If you recall from earlier, a tie-in sale is when an industry member requires a retailer to purchase one product in order to obtain another product, maybe a product in higher demand. TTP ruling 2016-1. This ruling relates to basically category management type activities. It's it refers to one of the exceptions in Subpart D, which allows industry members to provide a shelf plan or shelf schematic to retailers. This clarifies that shelf schematic exception in 27 CFR 6.99B is limited to furnishing retailers with the shelf plan recommending product placement only. Nothing else can be included in. It provides general guidance concerning promotional activities commonly associated with category management programs. And it reminds industry members that if a thing of value is not specifically exempted in Subpart D, it is an inducement. And we talked about that early. We don't want industry members to read a Subpart D exception and then assume that something similar might be an exception as well. If it's not specifically articulated in the Subpart D exceptions, it is not an exception. And if you have a question about it, certainly send a message to us, and we will be happy to review it and let you know whether the Subpart D exceptions apply. Next is TTP ruling, and this is the most recent ruling, 2017-2. This is I talked about this earlier when we were talking about lawful returns under consignment sales, freshness, dating, and allowable returns of malt beverage products under the FAA Act. This ruling describes circumstances under which malt beverage products that have been deemed unsuitable for sale because of freshness concerns can be returned without violating those consignment sales provisions. And essentially, it provides that malt beverages may be returned under the following conditions. The brewer has policies and procedures in place that specify the date the retailer must pull the product. Such policies and procedures are verifiable and consistently followed by the brewer. The container has identifying marks that correspond with that pull date. And this is the most important, the malt beverage product pulled by the trade buyer may not re-enter the retail marketplace. Lastly, this is our most recent industry circular, 2018-7, and this is industry compliance with trade practice laws and regulations. This reinforces TTB's commitment to a level playing field through trade practice enforcement. It provides an overview of the violations that we're currently finding in the marketplace. And it also reminds industry members about our voluntary disclosure program. trade practice proceedings. So what are the consequences of violating the federal trade practice provisions? A violation of the trade practice provisions may result in criminal charges, injunction or consent decree, revocation or suspension of a basic permit, or denial of an application to update or renew a basic permit. And in lieu of these consequences, violations may sometimes be resolved, may be resolved through an offer in compromise. Okay, just to touch on a few of these consequences, permits, they may be annulled if the Secretary finds it was obtained through fraud, misrepresentation, or concealment of material fact. Any permit may be revoked if a permittee has not engaged in business for 2 or more years. Permits may be revoked or suspended if the permittee willfully violates any conditions of the basic permit. However, permits cannot be revoked for a first-time violation. They can only be suspended. In an alternative to suspension or revocation, TTB can accept offers in compromise under 27 U.S.C. 207. Violations of the FAA trade practice provisions can result in criminal charges against any person who violates the act. It's a misdemeanor, and there's $1,000 fine for each offense. And remember, for consignment sales violations, this can include the retailer. As you may know, since 2017, TTB has increased its enforcement and educational efforts in the area of trade practices. The next few slides are going to provide some of the results of our increased enforcement efforts. And I'm not able to go into the particulars about these cases, but you can read the press releases associated with them on our website at www.ttb.gov. Here are some of the offers in compromise that we have accepted within the last year. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll leave them up for a minute or so. You can see in parentheses we have, the types of violations, and you'll notice that most of them are tied house violations. Some exclusive outlet consignment sales. Here are some of the suspensions, and all of our suspensions are relating to consignment sales violations. Again, I'm not going to read specific industry members, but you can get an idea. We have a fair amount of consignment sales violations. More suspensions for consignment sales, and more suspensions for consignment sales. In addition to our enforcement efforts, we have significantly increased our educational efforts over the last few years. In FY 2018, we put on 8 individual trade practice seminars in the states of Florida, California, Illinois, and Massachusetts. In addition to these seminars, TTB also participated in several webinars, like this one we're having today, and other in-person presentations on our trade practice program and our regulations. Additionally, in 2019, TTB also put on 8 individual trade practice seminars in the states of New York, California, Washington, and Missouri. And again, in 2019, we've also participated in webinars and other in-person presentations on our trade practice regulations and programs. And additionally, I'm happy to say that we're currently developing some educational trade practice videos that we hope to have available hopefully by the end of this year, if not the beginning of 2020. So we'll definitely be advertising those videos when they're available on our ttb.gov and through our newsletters. And, in addition to our educational efforts and our cases that we have concluded, we have multiple active cases that are either under investigation or they are also many that are in the resolution phase. So this concludes my presentation. I know this was a lot of information to take in. If you have any questions about the information or the presentation or whether certain practices may be prohibited under trade practice rules, or if you have any just general questions about the trade practice regulations, you may send your questions to our trade practices at ttb.gov, and we will definitely get to answer your questions as expeditiously as we can. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that this was useful to you, and it's my privilege.
All right, Lisa, thank you so very much for your time and for sharing your valuable knowledge with us. And thank you all for joining NABCA and TTB on this webinar. If you have questions, again, we encourage you to send them directly to the TTB at tradepractices@ttb.gov. And also, please visit the NABCA website at nabca.org for various resources, including white papers, previous webinars, and other materials. We would like your feedback about this session, and we'll soon be sending you a quick survey to complete. Also, let me know of any suggestions for future NABCA webinars. It is our goal to give you the education and tools you need to perform your function effectively. Wishing everyone a great day. Thank you all so much, and goodbye.